At 68 years old, I sold the company I built from nothing for $58 million. To celebrate, I took my only son and his wife to the fanciest restaurant in the city. He smiled, he toasted my success, and then when he thought I wasn't looking, he tried to kill me. What my son didn't know is that someone else was watching, and that one quiet warning would set in motion a plan to dismantle his entire world, piece by piece. Before I continue this story, please let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you believe that a legacy is something you build, not just something you inherit. The restaurant was the kind of place where the silence had weight. It was broken only by the gentle clinking of silver on porcelain and the low murmur of conversations from people who never had to raise their voices to be heard. Across the starched white tablecloth, my son Kevin and his wife Brenda were performing. Their smiles were too bright, their praise too polished. They looked at me with an awe that felt rehearsed, like a scene they had practiced in the car on the way over. "$58 million, Dad," Kevin said, shaking his head as if in disbelief. The crystal wine glass looked fragile in his hand. "Can you even wrap your head around that number? It's incredible, a true testament to your entire life." I simply nodded, taking a slow sip of my cranberry juice. I could feel the lie behind his words. It had a familiar taste, bitter and sharp. For 40 years, I had poured my life into Callahan Logistics, starting with a single used truck and a conviction that I could do it better than anyone else. I remembered the sleepless nights, the grease under my fingernails, the constant worry that gnawed at my stomach. I built that company on sweat and integrity, two things Kevin had never understood. He saw the $58 million, but he had never seen the sacrifice. Brenda reached across the table and placed her hand on mine. Her skin was cold, her touch fleeting. "We are just so proud of you, Jack. Really. Now you can finally relax. Enjoy the fruits of your labor. Let us take care of you." The phrase hung in the air. Let us take care of you. It sounded less like an offer and more like a proposal. I looked at my son, searching for the boy I remembered. The one who used to ride shotgun in my first truck, his small hand clutching a toy car. But that boy was gone. In his place was a man whose eyes held the cold, hard gleam of entitlement. My late wife Alicia had seen it years ago. I remember her standing by the window after one of Kevin's many requests for money, a quiet sadness in her eyes. "Be careful, Jack," she had told me. "He sees you as a bank, not a father." At the time, I thought she was being too harsh. Now, sitting in this temple of wealth, her words echoed in my mind like a prophecy. The conversation drifted a shallow river of meaningless pleasantries. They asked about my health, but didn't wait for the answer. They talked about their plans, a trip to Europe, a new car, all spoken with the casual assumption that their financial worries were now a thing of the past. They were spending my money before it had even settled in my account. I felt a familiar ache in my chest, the dull throb of disappointment that had become my constant companion whenever I was around my son. I had hoped this night would be different, that the magnitude of this achievement might finally earn me a sliver of genuine respect. But I was wrong. I was not a father celebrating with his family. I was a vault waiting to be opened. After the main course was cleared, Kevin stood up, his smile widening. "Brenda, my love," he said, extending a hand. "They're playing our song. Will you dance with me?" It was a classic. A slow ballad from a bygone era. Another performance, another gesture designed to show me what a happy, loving couple they were. Brenda accepted with a demure nod, and they made their way to the small dance floor near the grand piano. I watched them move together, their bodies swaying in perfect rhythm. From a distance, they were the picture of happiness. But I knew the truth. I had paid off Kevin's gambling debts 3 times. I had co-signed the mortgage on their oversized house. Their picture-perfect life was a fragile illusion held together by my money. I turned my attention back to my drink. Just cranberry juice. My doctor had been firm after my last checkup. Your heart is strong, Jack, but it's not invincible. No more whiskey. From now on, you're a cranberry juice man. It was a small sacrifice for a longer life. I swirled the deep red liquid in my glass, watching the ice cubes clink against the sides. A life I intended to enjoy. That's when I noticed him. A man in a sharp security guard uniform was approaching my table. He was older, maybe in his early 60s, with a posture as straight as a steel rod and eyes that missed nothing. He moved with a quiet purpose, his gaze fixed on me. He stopped beside my chair, leaning in slightly, as if to share a secret. "Mr. Callahan," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. It was calm but laced with an undeniable urgency. "I don't mean to alarm you, sir." He paused, his eyes flicking towards the dance floor, and then back to me. "But I was standing near the bar. I saw your son. When he was coming back to the table a few minutes ago, he thought no one was watching. I saw him pour something from a small vial into your juice." The world stopped. The music from the piano faded. The clinking of glasses disappeared. All I could hear was the frantic pounding of my own heart. I stared at the man whose name tag read Marcus. His face was a mask of professional concern, but in his eyes I saw genuine worry. He was telling the truth. I didn't gasp. I didn't shout. Years of negotiating tough contracts and dealing with crises had taught me to control my reactions. A cold wave washed over me, so chilling it felt like ice water in my veins. I looked down at the glass in my hand. The deep red liquid, once a symbol of my healthy choices, now looked like a cup of poison. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to throw it against the wall, to confront my son, to cause a scene. But I did none of those things. I simply looked at Marcus, and a silent understanding passed between us. I gave him a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the confirmation he needed. He straightened up, gave a slight touch to the brim of his cap, and walked away, disappearing back into the shadows of the restaurant. My mind raced, connecting dots I had refused to see for years. Kevin's impatience, his constant questions about my will, his frustration when I told him I planned to live another 20 years. It wasn't just greed. It was something far darker. He didn't just want my money. He wanted me gone. The boy I had raised, the child I had loved, had just tried to murder me for his inheritance. The thought was so monstrous, so unnatural, that for a second my breath caught in my throat. But the cold, hard logic was undeniable. The $58 million had not been a celebration. It had been a death sentence. Just then the song ended. I saw Kevin and Brenda making their way back to the table, their faces flushed with laughter. They looked so normal, so happy. My own son walking towards me with a smile minutes after trying to poison me. The coldness inside me solidified into something else, something hard and sharp. It was resolve. As they sat down, I put on the performance of my life. I clutched my stomach, letting out a soft groan. "Brenda, your father is a terrible actor." Kevin laughed. I shook my head, forcing a pained expression onto my face. "No, it's not that." I rasped, my voice deliberately weak. My stomach, it just seized up on me. An old problem. I think I need to get home. Brenda's face filled with a theatrical display of concern. "Oh my goodness, Jack. Do you need a doctor? Let us drive you home." "No, no," I said, waving my hand dismissively. This was the critical part. I couldn't let them near me. "It'll pass. I just need to lie down. I've already called an Uber. It's waiting outside." Kevin stood up, helping me out of my chair. His hand on my arm felt like a brand. "Are you sure, Dad? We don't mind. I'm sure," I said firmly. I steadied myself against the table, and in that moment my hand brushed against the tall glass of cranberry juice. With a motion that looked entirely accidental, I knocked it over. The red liquid spilled across the white tablecloth like a pool of blood. "Oh, clumsy me," I muttered. While they were distracted calling for a waiter, I grabbed the thick cloth napkin that had absorbed most of the spill. It was heavy and damp in my hand. Under the guise of wiping my trousers, I quickly folded it and shoved it deep into my coat pocket. It was my only evidence, my only proof of the terrible truth. I didn't wait for them to say another word. I turned and walked away, moving as quickly as my shaking legs would allow. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see the look of satisfaction I knew would be creeping onto their faces. 15 minutes later, I was in the back of a silent car, the city lights blurring into streaks of color through the window. My hand was still in my pocket, clutching the damp napkin. The sweet, cloying smell of cranberry filled the air. I didn't feel anger yet, or even sadness. That would come later. Right now, all I felt was a profound, chilling clarity. The trap had been set for me tonight. But as I held the proof in my hand, I knew they were the ones who were already caught. This was not the end. It was the beginning. The Uber dropped me off a few blocks from my house, disappearing into the river of late-night traffic. I stood for a moment under the orange glow of a streetlight, the damp folded napkin a heavy weight in my coat pocket. My home was just down the street, its warm lights a familiar beacon in the darkness. But I couldn't go there. Not yet. Home was a place of memories filled with the ghosts of a life I now realized was a carefully constructed lie. The photos on the mantelpiece, the family vacations, the birthdays, all of it felt tainted like a beautiful painting, now covered in a thin film of poison. To go home now would be to admit defeat, to let the grief and the shock overwhelm me. I couldn't afford that. Grief was a luxury. What I needed was certainty. I walked against the flow of the city, away from the quiet residential streets, and towards the harsh, impersonal lights of the downtown core. The night was alive with a different kind of energy here. Sirens wailed in the distance. The hum of the city was a constant, emotionless drone. It suited my mood perfectly. I needed sterility. I needed facts. I needed a place where truth was measured in parts per million, not in shades of love and betrayal. I knew a place, a private diagnostic lab tucked away in a medical building, one that advertised 24/7 service for wealthy clients who valued speed and discretion. Callahan Logistics used to have a contract with them for employee drug testing. I walked through the automatic glass doors into a lobby that was silent and cold. The air smelled of antiseptic and ozone. A young man sat behind a thick pane of glass, his face illuminated by the glow of a computer monitor. He looked up, his expression neutral. I pulled the damp napkin from my pocket. It was sealed inside a plastic bag I'd taken from a street-side trash can. I placed it on the counter in the transaction drawer. "I need a full toxicology screening on this," I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside me. "I need to know everything it contains, organic and inorganic. I need it done tonight. Money is not an issue." The technician, whose name tag read Ben, simply nodded. He slid the drawer back, examined the sample with professional detachment, and began typing at his computer. "A Priority 1 toxicology panel will be expensive, sir." "Just do it," I said, pulling out my credit card. He ran the card, slid a form towards me, and pointed to a line at the bottom. "I'll need a contact number or email to send the encrypted results when they're ready. Should be about 3 to 4 hours." I wrote down my private email address, pushed the form back, and turned to leave. There was a small, sterile waiting area, but I couldn't sit there. I couldn't be still. I needed to keep moving. I found a small, all-night diner a block away, the kind of place that felt unstuck in time. I ordered a black coffee I had no intention of drinking, and sat in a booth by the window, watching the city's nocturnal life unfold. My mind started to work, processing the situation with the same methodical logic I used to build my business. My first instinct, the instinct of any citizen, was to call the police, to report the crime, but I immediately dismissed the thought. A police report would create a public record. The story would leak to the press. I could see the headlines now. Logistics mogul Jack Callahan poisoned by his own son. My name, my company's name, my legacy, all of it would be forever tied to this single sordid act of betrayal. Alicia's memory would be dragged through the mud. It would become a public spectacle, a feast for tabloids and gossip columnists. No. This wasn't a crime that could be healed by a public trial and a prison sentence. This was a deep, malignant cancer within my own family. It required not a policeman's handcuffs, but a surgeon's scalpel, a private, precise, and radical excision. I thought back searching for the signs I must have missed. I saw Kevin as a boy, a child who could lie with a placid, innocent face. I remembered him blaming the neighbor's kid for a window he had broken, a lie he held onto even when confronted with the truth. I remembered his teenage years, the string of borrowed and unreturned items, the casual disregard for other people's property or feelings. I had called it carelessness, immaturity. I had made excuses for him, telling myself he would grow out of it. Alicia had known better. She had tried to warn me. I had been a fool. A loving, hopeful, but ultimately blind fool. The most chilling thought was the vial. Marcus, the security guard, had been specific. A small vial. That meant this wasn't an impulsive act of anger. This was premeditated. My son, my only child, had researched my health conditions. He had acquired a specific substance. He had carried that vial to the restaurant with a clear and singular purpose. He had waited for the right moment, a moment of distraction, to turn a celebratory dinner into an execution. He had smiled at me, toasted my health, all while knowing he had just delivered my death sentence into my glass. The sheer coldness of it, the absolute lack of a soul, was what truly terrified me. My phone buzzed on the table. It was an email. The subject line was a sterile string of numbers, a case file ID. My heart hammered against my ribs. I took a deep breath, opened the encrypted file, and began to read. The document was filled with chemical names and technical jargon, but there was a summary at the top written in plain English for the client. My eyes scanned the words. Substance detected, metoprolol tartrate. Concentration 2,500 milligrams per 100 milliliters. I didn't know the name, but I kept reading. The technician had added a clinical note. Metoprolol is a beta blocker commonly prescribed for cardiovascular conditions. The standard therapeutic dosage is typically 25 to 100 milligrams. The detected concentration is exponentially higher for an individual with a pre-existing cardiac condition. Ingestion of this dosage would almost certainly induce acute myocardial infarction within 1 to 2 hours, the symptoms of which would be virtually indistinguishable from a naturally occurring fatal heart attack. A heart attack. That's how it would have looked. The grieving son, the tragic but not entirely unexpected death of an aging businessman. It was the perfect murder. I closed the phone. The coffee in front of me had gone cold. A tiny, desperate part of me had been clinging to the hope that it was all a mistake, a misunderstanding, a terrible, elaborate prank. But that hope was gone now, obliterated by the cold, hard science on the screen. The document was a death certificate that had thankfully not been needed. I looked out the diner window. The first hints of dawn were beginning to soften the edges of the city. A new day was beginning. I felt no anger, no rage. Those emotions were too hot, too chaotic. What I felt was a profound, icy calm. The kind of calm that comes when all uncertainty is stripped away and only the brutal, unavoidable truth remains. My son had tried to kill me, and now I knew exactly what I had to do. The time for grieving the son I had lost was over. It was time to deal with the monster he had become. I picked up my phone again, but I didn't dial 911. I dialed the private number of my lawyer, Cynthia Walsh. It was time to assemble my army. I left the diner and walked. The sky was turning from the deep, inky black of night to a bruised purple, the first sign of a dawn I felt completely disconnected from. The city was still mostly asleep, but my mind was wide awake, buzzing with a cold, electric energy. Every step on the pavement was deliberate. Every breath was measured. The shock had burned away, leaving behind a core of pure, unyielding resolve. I knew who I had to call. There was only one person I trusted to navigate the storm that was coming. I stopped on a quiet corner and dialed her private number from memory. It rang twice. A voice clear and sharp even at this ungodly hour answered. "Walsh. Cynthia. It's Jack. I need to see you. Now." There was no hesitation, no sleepy confusion in her voice. Just immediate acceptance. "My office." 30 minutes. The line went dead. Her office was on the 40th floor of a glass and steel tower that overlooked the entire city. When I arrived, the building was silent, the main lobby empty except for a lone security guard. But the private elevator to her floor worked with my keycard just as she'd said it would. The doors opened not into a reception area but directly into her personal office. She was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, a silhouette against the slowly brightening skyline, a half-empty mug of coffee in her hand. Cynthia Walsh was in her late 40s, with her father's steady gaze and a mind that moved faster than anyone I'd ever known. Her father David had been my best friend, my partner in the early impossible days of the company. I had known Cynthia since she was a little girl with pigtails and a fierce love for argument. I watched her grow up, watched her pass the bar with top honors, and when David passed away, she took over his role as my legal counsel, my confidant, and the closest thing I had to a daughter. She was family forged in decades of shared history and absolute trust. "Jack," she said, turning from the window. Her eyes, sharp and analytical, scanned my face. "You look like you've been through a war." "The war is just beginning," I replied. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I sat down in one of the leather chairs opposite her large mahogany desk, and I told her everything. I started with the dinner at the restaurant, the stilted conversation, the fake smiles. I recounted the security guard's words, a story that felt no less insane, telling it the second time. Then I slid my phone across the polished surface of the desk, the lab report still open on the screen. She picked it up, her expression hardening as she read the clinical, brutal words. She placed the phone down gently, her knuckles white. She looked at me, and in her eyes I saw not just the outrage of a lawyer, but the personal fury of a loved one. "That son of a bitch," she whispered the words, a low, dangerous hiss. He finally did it. He finally crossed the line. She stood up and began to pace a coiled spring of energy. "All right. First call is to the district attorney. I'll wake him up myself. We'll have a warrant for Kevin's arrest before the sun is fully up. Attempted murder premeditated. With this lab report and the guard's testimony, it's an open and shut case." I held up a hand. "No." She stopped pacing and stared at me. "No, Jack. He tried to kill you." "And what happens then?" I asked, my voice quiet but firm. Headlines. A public trial. The Callahan name dragged through the mud for months, maybe years. Everything I built, everything Alicia and I stood for, reduced to a sordid true crime story. My legacy becomes my son, the murderer. Is that a victory, Cynthia? She was silent for a long moment, studying my face. She understood. This wasn't about what was legal. This was about what was right. "So what do you want?" she asked, her voice softening. "This isn't about punishment. It's about a correction. A permanent, irreversible adjustment of reality. Prison is too easy. It's an ending he doesn't deserve. I want to take away the one thing he was willing to kill for. I want to take away the money. All of it. I want him to wake up one day and realize that his entire world, the world he was so sure he was about to inherit, has vanished." A slow, dangerous smile touched Cynthia's lips. It was the same smile her father used to get when he was about to outmaneuver a competitor. "I see," she said. "This isn't a criminal case, this is a demolition. All right, Jack. If we're going to do this, we do it my way. We need more than this lab report. We need a complete picture. We need to know everything about them. Every dollar they owe, every friend they have, every secret they're keeping. We need to map out their entire life so we can find the precise points to apply pressure. She walked over to her laptop, her movements now filled with a fierce purpose. I know a firm, ex-FBI and former IRS agents. They're discreet as ghosts and they live for this kind of work. They can find out what brand of toothpaste Brenda uses from 3 states away. I'll have a team on them by sunrise. They will dig into every corner of Kevin and Brenda's lives. We'll have a full financial and personal workup within a week. I nodded. Good. While they're digging, I'll play my part. Cynthia raised an eyebrow. Which is the part they expect me to play, I explained. The grieving father, the oblivious old man. They need to believe their plan almost worked, that I had a minor health scare and nothing more. For them to get careless, they need to feel safe. They need to believe the prize is still within their grasp. I told her about the phone call I was anticipating from Kevin and the idea I had already planted in his head. I mentioned I was setting up a large family trust. I'm going to let them think that's still my main focus. I'll dangle the inheritance right in front of them. Cynthia's smile widened. Let their greed make them stupid. It's a classic strategy for a reason. It always works. She looked over at a framed photo on her bookshelf. It was of her, a grinning teenager, standing between me and her father on a fishing boat. My dad always said you were a better poker player than he was, she said softly. He told me you always knew when to hold, when to fold, and when to go all in. I looked at the photo, a pang of loss hitting me. David would have known what to do. He also said you were smarter than both of us combined. He was right. I remember when I was about 10, Cynthia recalled, her eyes distant for a second. You and my dad were in our living room spreading the blueprints for the first big warehouse across the floor. You were so excited. And I remember seeing Kevin. He must have been around 12, sitting in the corner of the room. He wasn't paying attention. He was just methodically breaking the arms off one of his action figures one by one because he was bored. We let that memory hang in the air. A small dark omen from the past. A warning we had all failed to heed. All right, Cynthia said, her voice snapping back to the present. The plan is set. Phase 1 is intelligence gathering. Phase 2 is the trap. You keep them calm and distracted. Let me handle the rest. As she turned back to her computer, her fingers flying across the keyboard, I walked to the window. The sun was now a brilliant orange line on the horizon. The city below was waking up, a million lights beginning to dim as the daylight took over. I felt no joy, no satisfaction, only the grim, heavy weight of purpose. My son had started a war when he poured that poison into my glass. But here in this office, 40 floors above the sleeping world, his father and his god-sister were building the machine of his defeat. The sun was rising on the first day of the rest of his life, and he had no idea it was already over. I didn't have to wait long. The next morning, as I was sitting in my study with a cup of black coffee, my phone buzzed. The caller ID showed Kevin's name. I let it ring 4 times, a deliberate hesitation to mask the fact that I had been expecting this call with absolute certainty. Finally, I picked up, composing my voice to sound a little tired, a little frail. Hello, I said, my voice just a touch weaker than usual. Dad. Oh, thank God you answered. Kevin's voice on the other end was a symphony of manufactured concern. It was a masterful performance, I had to admit. He sounded breathless, frantic. I was so worried. Brenda and we didn't sleep a wink last night. We kept calling, but it just went to voicemail. Are you okay? What happened? Did you go to the hospital? I could hear the rapid-fire questions for what they were. Not an inquiry into my well-being, but a desperate search for information. He needed to know if his plan had failed or if it had been discovered. He was probing for any hint of suspicion. I leaned back in my chair, the worn leather creaking softly, and prepared to give him the answer he so desperately wanted to hear. Easy, son. I'm all right, I said, with a soft chuckle as if dismissing his worry. Just a bit of a scare, that's all. I saw my doctor this morning. I paused, letting him hang on the words. He said it was nothing more than a bad case of indigestion. All that rich food, the sauces. My stomach isn't what it used to be. The doctor said it can sometimes feel like the real thing, a lot of pressure in the chest. But he ran some tests. My heart is just fine. I could almost feel the wave of relief coming through the phone. A quiet exhale. The tension in his voice immediately slackened. He wasn't listening to my words. He was listening for the absence of suspicion, and he had found it. The story was plausible. It was simple. It made him innocent. Indigestion. Are you sure that's all it was? He pressed one last check to be certain. You left in such a hurry. You looked so pale. The doctor is sure, and so am I said, letting a note of finality into my tone. My body's not the well-oiled machine it once was, Kevin. I guess that's just something I have to get used to. I sighed, a long, weary sound I had practiced in my head. It was a sigh designed to sound like a man contemplating his own mortality, a man who would soon be thinking about his legacy. This was the moment. The perfect opening. You know, son, I began, my voice softer now, more reflective. That little episode last night, it really got me thinking. You get to my age and you realize that time isn't a guarantee. We need to make sure things are in order. What do you mean, Dad? He asked, a new edge to his voice. The fake worry was gone, replaced by a sharp, focused curiosity. I let a few seconds of silence pass, as if I was gathering my thoughts. I've been on the phone with Cynthia Walsh this morning, I said, dropping her name deliberately. The mention of my lawyer would give my next words the weight of legal authority. We've been discussing my estate. That sale, $58 million. It changes things. It complicates things. Right. Yeah, of course, Kevin said quickly, his voice now dripping with anticipation. And I've decided, I said, delivering the bait with perfect casual precision, that the best way to handle it is to set up a significant family trust. A very large one. I want to make sure that you and Brenda are taken care of. Properly. I want to ensure that this money is a blessing for our family for generations to come, not a burden. Cynthia is drawing up the papers as we speak. Silence. For a full 5 seconds, there was absolute silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the gears turning in his head. I could almost feel the greed overwhelming every other thought, every other fear. The failed murder attempt. The close call, the lingering anxiety, it all evaporated in an instant, replaced by the dazzling, beautiful promise of a legally binding, ironclad fortune. A trust, he finally stammered, his voice thick with barely concealed excitement. Dad, that's incredible. You don't have to do that. We're fine. His protest was so weak, so transparent, it was almost laughable. It was the polite refusal of a man who had just been handed the keys to the kingdom. And there it was. The hook was set. The line went taut. The fish had taken the bait, the lure, the sinker, everything. Nonsense, I said, warmly, playing the part of the benevolent patriarch. You're my only son. Who else would I do this for? This is my legacy. Securing your future. That's all that matters to me now. I don't know what to say, he said. And for the first time, I believe he was telling the truth. His mind was so full of dollar signs that he couldn't form a coherent thought. He was already spending the money. He was already living in the future he had been willing to kill for a future he now believed was being handed to him on a silver platter. Don't say anything, I said, my voice gentle. Just stay close. Cynthia will need you and Brenda to come in and sign some preliminary documents in a week or so. We'll talk more then. For now, I need to rest. This old man is more tired than he thought. Of course, Dad. You rest. And thank you. Really, thank you. I hung up the phone and placed it softly on the desk. The silence of the study rushed back in. I stared at the dark screen, my reflection a faint ghost on its surface. I felt no joy, no triumph, just a grim, chilling satisfaction. The performance was a success. I had used his own monstrous greed as a weapon against him, and it had worked perfectly. He was now a willing, even eager participant in my plan. He felt safe. He felt victorious. He would be looking for a pen to sign his name, not for shadows in the corners. I had bought us time. Time for Cynthia's investigators to dig. Time for me to build the perfect, inescapable trap. The game was now being played on my terms, by my rules, and my son had no idea he had already lost. A week passed. It was the quietest, most disciplined week of my life. I went about my days with a deliberate, almost meditative calm. I answered Kevin's calls, which came daily, now filled with a cloying, sycophantic warmth. He asked about my health, about my appetite, about my conversations with Cynthia. Each question was a gentle probe, a nervous check to ensure the golden goose was still laying its eggs. I played my part perfectly. The aging father gratified by his son's sudden flood of affection, completely oblivious to the current pulling him under. I told him Cynthia was working through the complexities, that these things take time. He was patient. Of course he was. What's another week of waiting, when you believe $58 million is the prize at the end? While I was feeding him placid reassurances, Cynthia's investigators were moving like sharks through the murky waters of my son's life. On the 8th day, an email arrived from Cynthia. The subject line was a single word: report. The body of the email was empty save for a heavily encrypted PDF attachment. I opened it, and the quiet calm I had so carefully cultivated was replaced by a cold, hard knot of disgust in the pit of my stomach. The document wasn't just a financial report. It was a portrait of a life lived in a state of utter, reckless desperation. It began with a summary that took my breath away. Total unsecured debt, $750,000. This was spread across a dizzying array of credit cards, a dozen of them, each one maxed out to its limit. American Express Centurion Visa Black cards, with names that promised exclusivity and prestige. I scrolled through the itemized statements. They read like a fantasy life. 5-star hotels in the Caribbean. A $10,000 shopping spree at a boutique in Milan. A single dinner in New York City that cost more than the first car I ever owned. It was a lifestyle of champagne wishes and caviar dreams, all built on a foundation of plastic and broken promises. But that was just the beginning. I kept reading. They had a leased Porsche Cayenne for her and a BMW M5 for him, the monthly payments for which were astronomical. They were 3 months behind on both. The repossession notices were already being sent. They owned a sprawling house in a gated community, the very picture of suburban success. A house I had given them the down payment for as a wedding gift, believing they would build a life there, a family. I now saw that they had taken out a second mortgage on the property 2 years ago, borrowing against the equity I had gifted them. They had bled it dry. They were now 90 days delinquent on both mortgages. The foreclosure process was about to begin. It got worse. The investigators had uncovered a series of high-interest personal loans. These weren't from banks. These were from private lenders, the kind of people who don't send polite letters when you miss a payment. The total came to another $500,000. These were loans taken out to pay off other loans, a frantic, desperate juggling act to keep the whole illusion from crashing down. They were drowning. The grand total, when all the numbers were tallied, was staggering. Kevin and Brenda, my successful son, and his lovely wife were more than $2 million in debt. They weren't just living beyond their means. They were living in a completely different financial reality, a fantasy world propped up by lies and leveraged to the hilt. I leaned back in my chair, the numbers swimming before my eyes. And suddenly, the attempted murder, the vial of poison, the cold-blooded plan. It all snapped into a new, terrifying focus. I had thought it was about greed. Simple, ugly, impatient greed. I had imagined them wanting to accelerate their inheritance to fund a life of even greater luxury. But I was wrong. This wasn't about funding a future dream. It was about escaping a present nightmare. The $58 million wasn't a bonus. It wasn't a jackpot. It was a lifeline. It was the only thing that could save them from the catastrophic collapse of their entire world. The foreclosure, the repossessions, the dangerous lenders calling in their debts. It was all about to come crashing down on them. They weren't just desperate for my money. They were terrified. They were cornered animals, and a cornered animal will do anything to survive. The realization settled over me cold and heavy as a tombstone. This wasn't a crime of passion or a simple act of avarice. It was a business decision, a cold, calculated risk assessment. In their minds, the potential reward erasing $2 million of debt and gaining access to millions more far outweighed the risk of getting caught. My life had been reduced to a number on a balance sheet, and they had decided it was time to cash it in. I looked at the report again. The names of the restaurants, the designer brands, the exotic locations. It was a hollow, empty life, a performance for an audience that didn't exist. They had built a beautiful house of cards on a cliff's edge and the wind was starting to blow. They had gambled everything on the belief that I would die soon, either by nature's hand or by theirs. A new kind of anger began to simmer within me. It was different from the initial shock and betrayal. This was a cold, precise fury. My son hadn't just tried to kill his father. He had taken every gift, every opportunity, every act of love I had ever given him, and he had twisted it into a weapon to be used against me. He had used my generosity to fund the very lifestyle that now threatened to destroy him, and he had decided my death was the price of his salvation. I closed the file. The first piece of the puzzle was in place. I now understood their motive not just with my heart, but with the cold, hard logic of a balance sheet, and it was far uglier than I could have ever imagined. I forwarded the email to Cynthia with a simple note. The foundation is rotten. Keep digging. If the first report from the investigators was a punch to the gut, the second one, which arrived 4 days later, was a dagger to the heart. I had spent those days in a state of cold fury, processing the sheer scale of my son's financial desperation. I thought I had understood the motive. I thought I had seen the bottom. But I was wrong. There were deeper, darker levels of betrayal I had not yet imagined. The email from Cynthia was again marked with a single word. Update. I opened the attached file, and this time it wasn't a spreadsheet of debts and delinquencies. It was a collection of field notes, interview summaries, and audio file transcripts from the investigative team. They had been looking into Kevin and Brenda's recent activities, trying to understand how they were planning to use the money they were so sure they were about to receive. My eyes fell on the names of several high-end art galleries in New York, Boston, and Chicago. I felt a knot of confusion. What did any of this have to do with them, then? I saw the name of the first contact. Brenda Callahan. I began to read the transcript of a phone call recorded legally by an investigator posing as a gallery assistant. Brenda's voice, as described in the notes, was smooth-cultured and filled with a carefully rehearsed somberness. Yes, my name is Brenda Callahan, the transcript read. My father-in-law is Jack Callahan. You may know of his company, Callahan Logistics. She would pause, letting the name and the implied wealth settle in. Unfortunately, Jack's health has taken a turn for the worse. He's on his way out, I'm afraid, and we're trying to get his affairs in order. It's a difficult time for the family. My hands began to shake. On his way out. She was speaking about me as if I were already a ghost. The transcript continued. My late mother-in-law, Alicia, was an avid art collector. She left behind a small but significant collection of post-war American paintings. My father-in-law has tasked me with handling the disposition of the collection. He wants it done discreetly, a private sale to a discerning collector. He'd rather avoid the publicity and the fees of a major auction house. He wants to ensure her legacy finds a good home. I had to stop reading. I pushed my chair back from the desk and walked over to the wall of my study. Hanging there was the first painting Alicia and I ever bought together. It was a small landscape by a young unknown artist we'd met at a street fair. We didn't have the money for it, not really. We paid for it in 5 installments. I remember the day we brought it home to our tiny apartment. Alicia's face was lit with a joy so pure it almost hurt to look at. She hung it on the wall and said, "There, that's our window to the world we're going to build, Jack." My gaze drifted to another painting, a large, chaotic, abstract canvas of vibrant blues and fiery oranges. She had bought it the week she was declared cancer-free after her first long, brutal battle with the disease. "This is what recovery feels like," she had told me, her hand in mine. A beautiful, terrifying, wonderful mess. Each painting on my walls was a chapter of our life together. The collection wasn't an investment. It wasn't an asset. It was Alicia's soul rendered in oil and acrylic. She didn't just collect art. She collected feelings, moments, triumphs, and sorrows. Her spirit lived in the brushstrokes, in the colors, in the very fabric of the canvases. I returned to the desk and forced myself to keep reading. The report detailed how Brenda had sent high-resolution photographs of the paintings to the galleries. Photographs taken with her phone surreptitiously during the visits she had made to my house over the past few months. Those visits where she would bring me soup, fluff my pillows, and ask about my health with that same fake, cloying concern. All along, she wasn't checking on a family member. She was casing the joint. She was taking inventory of my wife's soul, preparing to sell it off to the highest bidder. The investigators had visited one of the galleries in person. The gallery owner recalled his conversation with Brenda. She said her father-in-law was failing fast, the report quoted. She claimed she was the sole heir to the collection and wanted to establish a baseline value for the estate. She was very clear that everything was to be kept strictly confidential until, as she put it, the inevitable happens. The inevitable. My death. I closed my eyes. I saw them. Kevin and Brenda walking through my home. Their eyes scanning the walls, not seeing the memories, not seeing the love, not seeing Alicia. They saw only price tags. They looked at a lifetime of passion and saw a quick way to pay off their credit cards. They looked at my wife's legacy and saw a down payment on a new Porsche. The attempt on my life had been about money. My money. That was a betrayal I was beginning to comprehend on a logical level. But this felt different. This was a desecration. This was an act of erasure. They weren't just trying to kill me. They were trying to annihilate my wife's memory, to liquidate her spirit for cash. And Kevin, my son. He had stood by and let this happen. He had let his wife, this vulture in designer clothes, circle his own mother's legacy. He was complicit in every lie, in every whispered insinuation about my failing health. This was a betrayal so profound, so monstrous, it eclipsed everything else. He wasn't just stealing from his father. He was robbing his own mother's grave. The cold, analytical anger I had felt over their debts was now consumed by a white-hot, righteous fury. This was no longer a strategic game of chess. This was a holy war. The $58 million was just money. It was paper. But Alicia's collection, that was sacred, and they had dared to defile it. I looked at the last painting she had ever bought, a serene, almost ethereal seascape that hung opposite my desk. She could sit and look at it for hours. "It's so peaceful, Jack," she used to say. "It feels like coming home." My resolve hardened into something akin to tempered steel. The man who had sat in the diner, the father who had grieved for his lost son, was gone. The part of me that had hoped for some explanation, some sliver of redemption for Kevin, died in that moment. You can't redeem a soul that has already been sold. I picked up the phone and called Cynthia. She answered on the first ring. "I got the report," I said. My voice was different now. All the weakness, all the feigned frailty was gone. It was the voice of the man who had built an empire from nothing. The voice I hadn't used in years. "Jack, I'm so sorry," she began. "Don't be," I cut her off. "Be ready. I'm done gathering intelligence. I'm done playing games. I don't want to just correct them anymore, Cynthia. I want to build a wall of consequences so high and so thick they will never see the light of day again. I want to erase them." I thought the anger I felt over the betrayal of Alicia's memory was the final stage. I believed my resolve had already been forged into its final shape. I was wrong. There was one last report to come from Cynthia's team, and it would change the nature of my anger from a raging fire into a block of solid ice. It arrived the next day. The subject line was simple final report. I opened the document, and the first page was a high-quality scan of a legal form. It was a medical power of attorney, a document granting full and unrestricted authority to one Kevin Callahan to access any and all medical records and make critical health decisions on behalf of his father, Jack Callahan. My signature was at the bottom, a familiar, confident scrawl. Except it wasn't my signature. I have signed my name on hundreds of thousands of documents in my lifetime, from multi-million-dollar contracts to simple birthday cards. I know its every curve, every angle, every subtle imperfection. The signature on that document was a masterful forgery. It was a near-perfect imitation, close enough to fool any clerk or hospital administrator who wasn't looking for a lie. But it was a lie. I had never signed such a document. I had never in my darkest nightmares considered giving my son that kind of power over my life. The investigator's notes below the image were brief and chilling. The document had been filed with the records department at my primary hospital 3 months ago. 3 months. This wasn't a recent, desperate impulse. This was a long-term plan set in motion long before the company sale was even finalized. He had been laying the groundwork for months. As I scrolled to the next page, the true horror of his plan began to unfold. The investigators had subpoenaed the hospital's access logs. The report detailed every file Kevin had requested and received using that forged document. My complete cardiac history, the full results of my latest stress test, a detailed list of my prescriptions including their dosages and known side effects, my documented allergies. He had obtained a complete operational blueprint of my body's specific frailties. But the investigators hadn't stopped there. They had followed the digital breadcrumbs. The final section of the report detailed the internet search history from a series of burner phones and public library computers, all traced back to my son. The search terms were laid out in a simple bulleted list, a timeline of a murder being planned. How to get medical records of a parent. Fast-acting heart attack-inducing drugs. Tasteless beta blockers over the counter. Lethal dosage metoprolol for 200 palmopral male with cardiac history. How to fake a natural death. Will an autopsy show metoprolol overdose? I read the list twice, then a third time. The words just hung there on the page, stark and undeniable. This was the smoking gun. This was the final missing piece of the puzzle. It connected everything. The forged document was how he got the knowledge. The internet searches showed his intent, and the lab report from the restaurant was the proof of his execution. I leaned back, and for the first time the full monstrous scope of his actions became clear. This wasn't just a son trying to kill his father for money. This was a strategist executing a meticulously researched plan. He had studied my medical records the way a general studies a map of enemy territory, searching for the precise point of weakness to launch his attack. He had approached my murder with the detached clinical precision of a scientist solving an equation. My life was a variable he needed to eliminate. The intimacy of it was what broke me. He had taken the most private information about my existence, the very data doctors used to keep me alive, and he had weaponized it against me. It was the ultimate perversion of the bond between a parent and a child. A son is meant to be a protector, a guardian in one's old age. My son had made himself my assassin. In that moment, any lingering sentiment I had for him, any ghost of the boy he used to be, turned to ash and blew away. The man who had done this was not my son. He was a stranger. A cold, calculating predator who looked at me and saw not a father, but an obstacle. The emotional connection, the cord that had bound me to him for 40 years, was finally and irrevocably severed. The anger was gone now, replaced by something far colder and far more dangerous. A profound, empty certainty. There were no more questions. There were no more doubts. There was only the endgame. The time for investigation was over. The time for action was here. I picked up my phone. I didn't need to look up Cynthia's number. I dialed. She answered immediately. "Did you see it?" she asked, her voice tight with rage. "I saw it," I replied. My own voice was calm, steady, and devoid of any emotion. It was the voice I used when I was about to close a deal, the voice I used when I was about to win. "We have everything we need. The picture is complete. What do you want to do, Jack?" "It's time to set the meeting," I said. "Book the main conference room for next Tuesday. Tell them it's the formal signing of the Callahan Family Trust. Tell them to come prepared to celebrate." I paused, looking out the window at the clear blue sky. It's time for the reading of the will, so to speak. Except the only thing I plan on giving my son is the truth. Every last damning piece of it. The day of the meeting arrived under a sky the color of slate. I stood by the window in Cynthia's 40th floor conference room, looking down at the city below. The cars were like tiny metallic insects, each one moving with a purpose, completely unaware of the quiet, life-altering event about to take place high above them. The room itself was designed for power. A long, dark mahogany table polished to a mirror shine reflected the gray light from outside. 12 high-backed leather chairs stood like silent, imposing sentinels. This was not a place for family chats. This was a place where fortunes were made and futures were broken. Cynthia and I had been there for an hour preparing. We didn't speak much. We didn't need to. Every step had been choreographed, every document triple-checked. On the table in front of her chair sat a neat stack of 5 thick blue folders. To anyone else, they would look like standard legal paperwork. To us, they were an arsenal. She adjusted them slightly, aligning their edges with perfect precision. It was the calm, methodical gesture of a surgeon laying out her instruments before the first incision. At precisely 10 o'clock, the door opened. Kevin and Brenda entered, and they brought with them a wave of triumphant energy that felt alien in the solemn, quiet room. They were dressed for the occasion. Kevin wore a tailored suit I had never seen before, and Brenda was in a bright, expensive-looking dress, a stark splash of color against the room's muted tones. They were glowing, radiating a kind of manic, giddy happiness that comes from a long-awaited victory. Dad Kevin boomed his smile so wide it looked painful. He strode over and wrapped me in a hug. It was the first time he had initiated a hug in 20 years. I stood perfectly still, my arms at my sides, enduring the contact. It felt like being embraced by a stranger, his touch a violation that made my skin crawl. He smelled of expensive cologne and greed. Brenda was right behind him, placing a kiss on my cheek. "Jack, you look wonderful," she chirped, her eyes sparkling. "See, we told you, a little rest was all you needed." Her gaze darted past me, fixing on the stack of folders on the table. A flicker of pure, unadulterated avarice. It was there and gone in a second, but I saw it. They greeted Cynthia with a casual, almost dismissive air. "Cynthia, good to see you," Kevin said, already moving to take a seat. To them, she was merely the help, the legal functionary processing their windfall. They had no idea they were looking at the architect of their ruin. They sat on the opposite side of the table, a perfect picture of a happy couple about to become fabulously wealthy. They held hands, their fingers intertwined. Brenda couldn't stop smiling, her eyes continuously flicking between my face and the blue folders. Kevin leaned back in his chair, affecting an air of casual command, as if this room, this table, this fortune was already his. So he said, rubbing his hands together, "The big day. The signing of the Callahan Family Trust. It has a nice ring to it, doesn't it, honey?" "It sounds like a legacy," Brenda replied, her voice soft and reverent. I watched them, a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope. I studied their expressions, their body language, the way their eyes lit up when they spoke of the future. A future built on my death. A future that would never come to pass. A strange sort of calm settled over me. I felt a profound, almost out-of-body detachment. I was memorizing this moment, this final fleeting scene of their blissful ignorance. This was the last time I would ever see them smile. Cynthia, ever the professional, offered them coffee or water. They both accepted water, their excitement making them thirsty. As the assistant poured, Kevin was already talking about plans. "We were thinking of a trip to the Greek islands to celebrate," he said, looking at me. "You should come, Dad. You deserve a real vacation." "That's thoughtful of you, son," I said, my voice even. The room fell silent as the assistant left, the heavy door clicking shut behind her with an air of finality. The sound seemed to echo in the quiet space. It was the sound of a lock turning, the sound of the trap being sprung. Cynthia sat down, her posture perfect, her expression unreadable. She placed her hands flat on the table, framing the stack of folders. She looked directly at Kevin, then at Brenda, her gaze holding them for a long, uncomfortable moment. The giddy energy in the room began to curdle, replaced by the first faint hint of unease. "Thank you both for coming," she began, her voice crisp and clear, cutting through the silence. "Before we proceed to any signing, there are a few preliminary items on the agenda that we need to address." Her tone was all business, but the look in her eyes was something else entirely. It was the look of a predator that knows the hunt is already over. Kevin's smile faltered just for a second. Brenda's hand tightened on his. The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken truths. The performance was over. The execution was about to begin. Cynthia let the silence in the room stretch for a long moment. She folded her hands on the table, her expression as calm and unreadable as a marble statue. Kevin and Brenda fidgeted, their triumphant smiles beginning to look like fragile masks. "Thank you both for coming," she said again, her voice cutting cleanly through the tension. "As I said, there are a few preliminary items to address before any signing." She reached for the top folder in the stack. The soft sound of her opening it was unnaturally loud in the quiet room. She slid a single document across the polished table towards them. It was the lab report. "Item 1, Cynthia stated, her voice devoid of emotion. "This is a toxicology report from a certified private laboratory conducted on a sample retrieved from your father's table at the Grandview restaurant 2 weeks ago." Kevin's eyes darted down to the paper. His face went rigid. Cynthia didn't need to let him read it. She already knew the contents by heart. It details a concentration of metoprolol tartrate, approximately 25 times the standard therapeutic dose. A dosage the lab notes would be, and I quote, "virtually certain to induce a fatal myocardial infarction in a patient with Mr. Callahan's known cardiac history." Brenda stared at the paper, then at her husband, confusion warring with dawning horror on her face. Kevin didn't look at her. He couldn't. He just stared at the damning words in black and white. Before either of them could speak, Cynthia had already opened the second folder. "Item 2, she announced, sliding a thick financial statement across the table to land beside the first. "This is a full workup of your current financial situation. A consolidated summary of all assets and liabilities." She paused, letting them absorb the title page. "It details 2 delinquent mortgages, multiple pending vehicle repossessions, and a combined unsecured debt of $2,340,000. It also notes that foreclosure proceedings on your home were scheduled to begin next month." The color drained from Brenda's face. The last of her joyful glow was extinguished, replaced by a pasty, sickly pallor. Her hand, which had been resting on Kevin's, recoiled as if she'd been burned. The fantasy had evaporated. The ugly reality was now sitting on the table between them. I don't understand, Brenda stammered, looking at me. What is this? Cynthia ignored her. She was already opening the third folder. Item 3. This is a transcript of a phone call placed by you, Mrs. Callahan, to the Halloway Art Gallery in New York. Cynthia's eyes, cold and sharp as chips of ice, locked onto Brenda's. She read from the page in a flat monotone. My father-in-law, Jack Callahan. His health has taken a turn for the worse. He's on his way out, I'm afraid. He's tasked me with handling the disposition of the collection quietly. Kevin finally looked at his wife, his expression a mixture of disbelief and accusation. He had known about the debt, but I could see this was new to him. This was her own private betrayal. And finally, Cynthia said, her voice dropping, Item 4. She opened the last folder and slid the contents onto the growing pile of evidence. A copy of a forged medical power of attorney filed with Northwood General Hospital 3 months ago, and a corresponding log of internet searches conducted from burner phones for phrases including, but not limited to, lethal dosage metoprolol and how to fake a natural death. That was it. The final piece. The room was utterly silent. There was no breathing, no movement. It was the silence of a tomb. Kevin and Brenda were no longer people. They were statues of terror, their faces frozen in expressions of pure, abject horror. The beautiful future they had been celebrating just minutes ago had been systematically and brutally dismantled before their very eyes. Brenda found her voice first, a weak, trembling whisper. This is a mistake. I didn't. That's when I spoke. My voice wasn't angry. It wasn't loud. It was filled with a weariness so profound, it seemed to suck all the air out of the room. I looked directly at my son. There will be no family trust, Kevin. The finality in my words hit them like a physical blow. The last desperate flicker of hope in their eyes died. Cynthia took her cue. Your father is correct, she said, her professional tone returning. There is no trust for you to sign, because the disposition of the $58 million has already been finalized. She let that statement hang in the air for a moment. The entire sum has been transferred into a newly created, irrevocable charitable trust. It is called the Alicia Callahan Foundation. I watched their faces as Cynthia continued twisting the knife with cold legal precision. The foundation's charter is to provide grants to emerging young artists and to fund animal sanctuaries and wildlife preservation efforts, the two causes your mother cared about most in this world. She looked from one to the other. The papers were signed and legally recorded last week. The foundation is already operational. You have no access. You have no control. You will not see one single cent. The collapse was total. Brenda let out a sound, a half sob, half gasp. Kevin just sat there, broken, his world demolished. And then I laid out their future. You have two choices, I said, my voice as calm and steady as a surgeon's hand. They are the only two choices you have left in this world, so I suggest you listen carefully. Option 1. We end this meeting right now. Cynthia will place a call to the district attorney to whom she has a very close working relationship. This entire collection of evidence will be on his desk within the hour. You will be arrested and charged with conspiracy fraud and attempted murder. The evidence is overwhelming. You will both be convicted. You will spend decades in prison. Your lives as you know them will be over. I let them picture it. The handcuffs, the trial, the cell. Or I continued, there is option 2. Cynthia slid a single thick document across the table, followed by a pen. You sign this. It is a legally binding and irrevocable agreement. In it, you will relinquish any and all future claims to my estate, or the estate of your mother. You will sign over the deed to your house, the mortgages for which have been paid in full by a holding company, and the title now controlled by the foundation to the Alicia Callahan Foundation. You will pack a single suitcase each, and you will walk out of this office and out of my life forever. You will never contact me or anyone associated with me ever again. In return, I will not press charges. This evidence, I said, gesturing to the pile on the table, will be placed in a secure vault held in escrow by this firm. If you ever violate the terms of this agreement, in any way it will be delivered to the authorities immediately. You will have your freedom, but you will have nothing else. You will start over from zero, with nothing but the clothes on your backs. I leaned back in my chair. Cynthia and I said nothing more. The choice was theirs. Ruin or prison, erasure or extinction. The pen sat on the table between them waiting. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. The choice was between a life in ruins and no life at all. I watched as my son's hand, trembling slightly, reached for the pen. He didn't read the document. He just signed his name on the line Cynthia indicated. His signature, once so confident, was now the barely legible scrawl of a defeated man. He pushed the papers over to Brenda. Her tears fell silently onto the page, smudging the ink, as she added her own name to the surrender. They stood up, their movements slow and robotic. They didn't look at me. They couldn't. They walked out of the conference room, leaving behind their greed, their ambition, and their entire future. The heavy door clicked shut behind them, and in the silence that followed, I felt not victory, but the profound, quiet sorrow of a necessary end. That was 3 months ago. The seasons have changed. I am not in my large, quiet house. I am standing in a small, bright art gallery downtown. The air smells of fresh paint and possibility. The walls are covered in bold, vibrant canvases, the work of young artists who are seeing their dreams realized for the first time. This is the inaugural exhibition funded by the Alicia Callahan Foundation. A young woman with paint stains on her hands and a fire in her eyes is standing beside me, explaining her piece. It's a chaotic, beautiful burst of color that reminds me so much of my wife. I am listening to her, really listening, and I am smiling. It's a genuine smile, one that reaches my eyes. It feels unfamiliar, but welcome. I used to think a legacy was something you passed down, a torch of wealth and assets handed from one generation to the next. I spent my whole life building something to give to my son. I see now that I was wrong. A true legacy isn't what you leave to your family. It's what you leave in your community. It's the opportunities you create, the good you put out into the world that will continue to grow long after your name is forgotten. By taking away a fortune my son hadn't earned, I gave him the only thing my money could never buy him, the chance to build a life of his own. A life that has to be built on work and character, not on an inheritance. Whether he takes that chance is his choice, not mine. His story is his own now. But more importantly, we took the dark, ugly thing that his greed had created, and we transformed it. We turned a son's betrayal into an artist's first exhibition. We turned poison into paint. We turned a potential inheritance into an actual opportunity for hundreds of people I will never meet. In doing so, I am honoring my wife in a way that selling her collection never could have. I am keeping her spirit alive, not by preserving it in a silent house, but by letting it fuel the dreams of others. I didn't find peace in revenge. I found it in purpose. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you liked this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below.